most other social movements and their counter movements are a chicken egg kind of thing where they're responding to each other. Like you can't really sort of get at which came first.
Yeah.
With anti-fascism, there's a very distinct and clear answer. Fascism always comes first, and anti-fascism is always the response to that fascism.
Welcome back to Cream City Social. And this time, as maybe you can tell from the title, this is part one of two parts. We had an incredible conversation with Stanislav Vysotsky, who wrote the book American Antifa. This was about a year ago. We'll link his book in the description. But just got sucked in and ended up having a 3-hour conversation with him. I hope you guys are going to enjoy it. I know I did. And Daniel, do you have any thoughts on this interview?
Yeah, I thought this was a really interesting interview, especially this first part about fascism and fascists. It really surprised me how adaptable fascists are. When we think of fascism, we often think of it as a thing of the past, but as we learned in our conversation today, we learned that fascism is very much present in the modern day. We learned that fascists are very adaptable with technology and with changing their message to adapt to the times. And we even saw Italy recently elected a woman as a leader of a what many call neo-fascist party, who has expressed sympathy to Mussolini. And I also thought it was really interesting that a lot of the conversations and organizing that fascists have are hidden from public view. They know that there's a stigma behind their organizing, so a lot of it's done behind the scenes. So if we don't really remain vigilant and organize, we might see a powerful fascist movement in this country and unfortunately across the world.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And I was super surprised that the fascists are a bunch of techies, a bunch of hackers in their room with ham radios and all sorts of gear. So again, we'll have the next episode out next week on Wednesday. Look for that. Um, Personally, I think the second half of this conversation is almost more interesting than the first. So come back, check us out. And with that, here is a conversation with somebody making positive change in, I think, Canada. Well, thanks again for joining us, Stas. I'm very excited about this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me.
And like we said in the intro, we are going to be talking about fascism and anti-fascism and what it is, how it's evolved, and how we should think about it. Because as I've been going through my re-education in the last 4 or 5 years or so, I've had a hard time wrapping my head around what fascism is. And we'll get into it, but in the 1960s, it kind of became a larger term, an umbrella term, and it means a little bit different things than it used to mean. So it's used in all these different contexts, and I'm not sure that we quite know a good definition for it or what that usually entails. And then if we don't know what fascism is, we almost certainly, definitely don't know what anti-fascism is or Antifa is. And so we're super excited to have you, Stas, because you're an expert. You're the Associate Professor of Criminology and Sociology at the University of Fraser Valley in British Columbia. You've been published in journals like the Critical Criminology and the Journal of Crime and Justice. And then you just had a book come out in 2020. And it really gets into the history of it, the subculture, and then the tactics that each group uses. And it comes from a very social movement perspective, seeing how these groups operate and the subcultures that go along with it. And I'm really excited to have that conversation. But before we dive in and get to the real meat of your research and your book, I think that we got to get a little bit of background information to make sure that we're all playing with the same terms and they mean the same thing to us. So before we get right into saying what is fascism and what is anti-fascism, I'm going to pose a question to you. Can we think of one without the other? Can we think of fascism without anti-fascism? And can we think of anti-fascism without fascism?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And the best way to understand it is that you can think of one without the other, but there's also one that can't exist without the other. So fascism can, to a certain extent, exist without anti-fascism, because fascism is a very distinct kind of political ideology and movement that is affiliated with that political ideology, that is seeking to enforce that political ideology upon a population, ideally a global population. And fascism is, in many respects, a reaction to other kinds of ideologies, but that's true of really any political ideology. They tend to work in reaction to other belief systems, and certainly fascism is a reaction to a set of social and material conditions. And so,
Hmm.
and certainly, as we talked about prior to the interview, we the definition of fascism is one that we'll get to soon. But if we think about it, if we think just about fascism, fascism is an ideology and a movement that spawned because of a set of historical and social circumstances. It persists because of a set of historical and social circumstances, and it draws in certain kinds of people because of a set of historical and social circumstances. Now, having said that, so fascism can exist because there are certain things that are going to make fascism a belief system,
Appealing.
exactly, and it's going to be appealing, and it's something that would develop and certainly has developed under other names and in other forms in certain kinds of cultures and contexts. But so it exists, it can exist on its own. It doesn't need anti-fascism to exist.
Right.
Anti-fascism, on the other hand, can only exist in reaction to and relation to fascism, because anti-fascism recognizes, and again, this is kind of a weird way of talking about these things prior to having some really concrete definitions, but
And feel free to hop into
it'll make yeah.
definitions whenever you want to.
Oh, it'll make more sense as we sort of move along. But anti-fascism exists as what I label in my work a counter movement, and because it responds to the existence of fascism and to the maneuvers and mobilizations and activism that comes from the fascist movement. So while fascism can exist without anti-fascism, anti-fascism cannot exist without fascism. One of the things that I note in my work, and Mark Bray points out in his book and Antifa, is that anti-fascist activists are people who generally are drawn to anti-fascism because of their work in other kinds of social justice, political economic justice work. And so they're drawn to anti-fascism because fascism threatens either those movements directly or the populations that those movements are trying to work with, and to try to liberate and try to provide an egalitarian or an equal world for. Fascism threatens that. And so people become anti-fascist because fascism represents a kind of threat. And so if there were no fascism, they would simply be activists in those other arenas and those other areas, but they wouldn't necessarily have to be anti-fascists. Unlike a lot of other social movements where the dynamic, at least in sociology, is they refer to them as opposing movements, where they're kind of responding to one another in kind, because a lot of the time they're looking to make appeals about policy to government, to corporations, to some
Yeah.
form of authority in the society. That this is a movement that only exists because there's this other movement that threatens those other types of kind of social work, activism work that are being done. So in a kind of chicken and egg thing, most other social movements and their counter movements are a chicken egg kind of thing where they're responding to each other. Like you can't really sort of get at which came first.
Yeah.
With anti fascism, there's a very distinct and clear answer. Fascism always comes first, and anti fascism is always the response to that fascism.
So, with that, I think at this point we should define what fascism is. What is this thing that we're trying to deal with? And I know that's kind of a broad question, but could you give us a general sense of what fascism is about?
Mhm.
Yeah, oh, certainly. So one of the and you've already pointed out what one of the issues with fascism is that it's a concept and a term that has been defined so much and in so many different ways by so many different people, ranging from scholars who look at it historically. So there's a set of historical scholars who say that fascism can only be referred to as the very specific set of social movements in the interwar period and through World War II, and anything that sort of comes after that, it's like you got to call it something else, or it's like neo-fascism or whatever.
Find a new name
Uh,
for it. Yeah.
yeah, find a new name for it, 'cause it's those are very specific, historically bound kind of movements. And then you've got scholars of more contemporary fascism or historical fascism who believe that there's a general kind of sense of fascism, but they have very different criteria and categories and ways of analyzing it. Uh, and then you throw into the mix the way in which the term had become watered down, particularly throughout the post World War II period, where fascism became shorthand for authoritarianism, which is why you frequently see people on the right who use a kind of, and the far right, and even fascists who use a libertarian framing for their movements, try to accuse their opposition of being fascist. So we have this kind of ironic situation now where occasionally you'll have people who are fascist by the definition I'm about to give,
Uh-huh.
referring to their opposition as fascist because they think their opposition is being somehow authoritarian, which again is ironic, but nonetheless, this is very watered down
So,
concept of like,
fascist doesn't just mean authoritarian.
no, fascist does not mean authoritarian, and in the contemporary fascist movements, the way in which authoritarianism manifests itself is very different than it was in classical fascism, that kind of interwar World War II period fascism. The authoritarianism was very much this hierarchical towards a single leader model, and in contemporary fascism, there isn't that kind of hierarchical towards a single leader model, but there's still a kind of authoritarianism, which is we're starting to kind of delve and dig into the elements of what makes up fascism. So just to kind of get to the point instead of dancing around it, uh, basically what I like to do in terms of my work, and I think that this also aligns very well with what a lot of contemporary anti-fascists use in terms of definitions of fascism, is a fairly broad conceptual definition that I'm going to largely sort of paraphrase Shane Burley, who about fascism and anti-fascist movements, points out essentially that fascism is an ideology that believes in a hierarchy, a biological or social hierarchy of people, and enforces that hierarchy of people through violence. So that there's an inherent belief that there should be some hierarchy of people, that people should be stratified, that there are certain categories of people who belong at the top of that category of stratification, and that in order to get to that stratification or to maintain that stratification, because we obviously live in a stratified society already,
Yeah.
you have to use violence, both violence on the street level, so that kind of activist violence that you'd see from a group like the Proud Boys, to the violence of the state. So the idea basically is that once fascists have control of the state, they're going to set the the apparatus of the state, and in particular state's monopoly on the use of force, the way in which the state can deploy force through various law enforcement and military entities in order to construct and maintain that hierarchy, while not foregoing, by the way, that hierarchy on the street.
I was going to say,
So
are they linked? The street and the
they
government?
they are linked, so that the end goal for fascists is a society where that hierarchy is enforced by the state, but also gives a kind of tacit encouragement to individuals to also enforce that hierarchy through violence at the level of the street. And we certainly have seen this historically with fascist movements, where they come to power, they take control of the state, but then they also encourage their supporter, their most vocal and vigorous supporters to engage in street violence against the enemies of the fascist society.
So, in the book, you talk a little bit about how fascism in the United States is a little bit different from fascist movements in Europe, where they've sort of avoided building official party structures. So, I'm just curious, what kind of activities do fascists engage in the United States, and what kind of activities should we be on the lookout for?
Yeah. So there was a time when fascist movements in the United States tried to construct their own political parties and party-like movements. It's something that in my work I refer to as a political sector. So those are still around, but they, for various reasons, some of which have to do with a kind of shift within the movement to what they call a leaderless resistance model, where there isn't a hierarchical organization anymore, to simply the practicality of being a somewhat marginal political ideology in our current social context. And by marginal, I simply mean that they aren't organized into a clear, uh, organized political party to some extent.
They're not
Uh,
incorporated or they're
they're
not
yeah, they're not incorporated. They're not,
posting their
they
meetings
it's
online.
exactly. They're not fielding candidates, at least not explicitly under a kind of fascist party line. So we have this very decentralized movement. So we need to begin by understanding that the fascist movement in the United States is a very decentralized movement. So it's very widespread. It's very diffuse throughout the country, and so what it does then is also very diffuse. So there's not one necessarily playbook, but there are playbooks that they kind of generally follow. And in my book, I talk about a variety of broad categories of activism that fascists engage in. And I start with basically propaganda and the information campaigns and campaigns to engage in the public sphere. So fascists have been very, very good at deploying propaganda. Certainly old school, old style. When I first came up with some of these models almost 20 years ago, the propaganda campaigns primarily took the form of they printed their own newspapers and magazines and things of that nature, but then also they would engage in flyering campaigns. So they would take a classic thing that they would do is take flyers, put them in little like Ziploc bags, throw a little bit of sand or rocks at the bottom, and drive through a neighborhood and just throw them out the window at like
Oh,
every
really?
lawn. And they still do that. I saw a couple weeks ago that they're still doing that kind of stuff. So that's still part of the repertoire, is those kind of flyering campaigns, and also just going around and like stapling them or weed pasting them to like light poles and,
Are
and
those effective? Do
property.
they get
Should DSA be
membership that
doing that?
way?
Seems like easy
Occasion
door knocking.
it's occasionally. I mean, it's not it mostly is effective in that it actually creates a secondary effect. So what happens when they do those sorts of things is it frequently gets media attention.
Mm.
And then the media have frequently, and again, media have gotten better about this, partially because the technology has gotten better, so they can like show a flyer and blur the contact info in a way that they couldn't have done, 30, 40 years ago.
Mhm.
So the secondary media effect of getting that attention frequently is actually more effective than simply throwing a bunch of flyers on
Is
Than
that
getting the
why a
because
lot of these fascist rallies have been occurring in more liberal cities like Charlottesville and Portland? Is that part of their strategy?
that's also that's at least part of the strategy, and the rallies are also part of that propaganda campaign. They're out there trying to spread their message. It's basically like the thing that they do. So they have rallies that are supposed to draw attention, and historically, the model for having a rally was that they would go and have a rally where there had been some sort of incident, usually some sort of racialized incident, high profile bias crime, somebody who's very high profile, say like a mayor of a city makes a comment that's racist or xenophobic. And so there's this sense that, well, maybe this community is sort of welcome to hearing the message
Mm.
of the fascist movement. And that was historically what they did is they'd see this stuff on the news. They'd organize. It'd be like 2 weeks from now, we're gonna have a rally, yeah, in support of whomever, and or against immigration, because that was a really huge campaign on the part of the fascist movement and the far right, and in many ways signaled some of their transition into the kind of mainstream politics that they're in today. So they would have these rallies, and they would eh, do this, and there'd be huge counter protests, of course. And that strategy seems to have shifted, or at least it had shifted for what we can loosely call the Trump era. And from about 2015 to roughly like 2020, 2021, they had moved away from these communities where there had been a kind of incident to coming into communities that they knew were not going to necessarily be as receptive to their message, and that draws a lot of attention. It draws a lot of attention
Yeah.
locally because locally, there's this outrage that happens, but it also draws attention in terms of counter protests, which then also draws media attention. And a to some extent, any kind of media attention, there's no such thing as bad press for the fascist movement
They
to a
take that
certain
to heart.
extent. They really do, and it's effective,
I was
at
gonna
least in
say.
terms of reaching their target demographic, their target audience. And again, this is something that's been true. We're coming up on nearly 30 years of this being true. Because if we look back, I when I first started doing this kind of research and this kind of work, it was in the early to mid 90s. It's sort of on the tail end of the TV talk show era, where to get ratings they would always have these racist skinheads on, because they they were easy. The hosts would yell at them, or sometimes would sort of try to convince them of the error of their ways if they weren't the more yelly kind of host. And then of course there was the famous Geraldo Rivera incident where there was the huge brawl. And certainly people in your audience can just Google Geraldo Rivera racist skinheads, and you can still watch it on YouTube.
Oh,
It's a
that's funny. I've
famous
never heard
brawl.
that.
Oh yeah, it's a classic. I use it in my courses still, because things like that kind of it drew a lot of negative attention to racist skinheads. But if you were an angry white kid
Mhm.
anywhere in America, when you saw that, that was an effective form of propaganda for you. You saw these tough guys getting into a fight and brawling, and everybody is angry at them. And if you're angry at the world, like after that Geraldo Rivera, after every one of those kind of appearances where you platform fascists,
Mhm.
some number of people, particularly young people, were going to take up that cause, take up that ideology. And certainly in my early experience with this in the 80s and 90s and even into the early aughts, This was, you also joined that subculture because there were very, very clear aesthetic ways that you could show that you were a part of that movement. So
And
bring that back to that choice of targets of going to the more liberal cities. It's that same thing. It's you're showing your target demographic that you are tough, that you're willing to fight for what you believe in, that you're willing to basically show those libs. You're not just
mhm,
generating liberal tears. Now you're trying to generate liberal blood. Like show them that you are not somebody who can be messed with, and that because so much of the talking points are about taking your nation back. And this again goes back to classical fascism, is taking back the nation and restoring this historic vision of what the nation is supposed to be, a kind of national exceptionalism, which plays really well in the United States, and an
yeah,
idea of a historic mission plays very well, and a historic mission that's built on having a certain kind of power and domination plays very well to people, and certainly certain segments of the population. So this works as a recruiting tool in that respect,
s-
and it has been effective. It's also been totally ineffective, in part because of the anti-fascist opposition that is
uh-huh,
able to muster in those cities. But we can talk a little bit more about those
yeah.
dynamics, like, as we go through the interview.
Let's take a step back real fast, but I did want to pause on what you just said about them being mad at the world. And then on
Mhm,
Geraldo's show, everybody was mad at them. And anytime that
mhm.
you're mad and you're mad at the world, you're going to pretty much project that out in the world and you're going to receive that back. So they're watching the world be mad at them just as in their own life they experience the world mad at them. So they identify with these people on TV. I can totally
Mm.
see that being good propaganda.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And then when you couple that with this easy to digest identity, and this easy to digest identity, and this easy to engage in identity, which has been really amplified by social media and internet technology. It's been a boon for the movement.
Let's step one more step back. And who are these? Is it all we talked about the hierarchy of there's certain biological reasons that you should be at the top of the hierarchy. Does that pretty much mean men and whiteness? Is that race and gender? What does that totally entail? And what does that look like in real life now?
It does mean that. It
Yeah.
means exactly, we're talking about the kinds of hierarchies that have been established in our society through historical and social processes of domination. And so we're talking about a movement that is white supremacist. And when I talk about white supremacist here, I'm not talking about this. And this is something that we see in our culture, that there there's this idea that white supremacist is something that belongs within the individual, that they have a individual level belief, and this is true of all the things that I'm going to sort of go through. uh, but as a sociologist, I view these things as being systems, as being ways of organizing social life. So when I'm talking about white supremacy, I'm talking about a way in which our society is organized that places whiteness in a position of domination, and whiteness as a concept rather than necessarily even a distinct racial category. So they're white supremacist,
Mm,
they're patriarchal, and in the same way, it's a system that constructs masculine and male domination, and they are heteronormative, and they believe in a society that is dominated by cisgender heterosexual people. They are uh, effectively, historically, they used to be primarily Christian dominated. So that domination was Christian, though Christianity has fallen out of favor within a lot of the fascist movement as a belief system.
interesting.
There's still certainly a lot of Christian factions there, but they're not quite as powerful as they used to be. So it's much more the religious bigotry increasingly has become one that is built around a distinct Islamophobia and certainly
Mm.
anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism is really in many cases at the core of these movements, as Eric Ward pointed out in classic work from
Would they
2017.
would a white supremacist identify as a fascist?
Maybe, maybe not. Certainly a lot of people who are a lot of people who are contemporary fascists understand the negative perceptions of that label, and they
Yeah.
will shy away from this is why they've come up with all of these alternate terms.
Mm.
It's part of there's a constant process of branding is the best way to think about this for your audience, that there's this constant process of branding themselves as something that can be palatable, as something that can be acceptable. And so there are certainly people who would shy away from any of those terms, whether it be fascist, whether it be Nazi, neo-Nazi, white supremacist, even because there's a stigma associated with it. There's a negative connotation that comes with some of those labels, those names, those brands, those ideologies, and so they rebrand consistently. They say, well, we're white nationalists. We're not white supremacists. We're white nationalists, and there's an
Mm.
intention there of saying we are people who are cultural nationalists, not unlike the kind of cultural nationalism of historically marginalized, racialized people. And so we need to be treated with the same respect as, of course, they're completely different. There are two totally different playing fields here. Their national white nationalism is a nationalism of domination, as opposed to the nationalism of historically marginalized and subordinated groups who are trying to assert a kind of honor and dignity in their identity, as opposed to asserting a domination over others. So right. So there's that there's white nationalist. There is identitarian, which is a distinct ideological thread and framing within essentially the fascist movement that also builds on those kinds of concepts of unique ethnic identity. They'll use that. You know, it's how Richard Spencer came up with alt-right. Alt-right
Mm.
sounds so much better than fascist or
It
white
sounds like a
supremacist
cool
or
genre of
white national.
music.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
that's what he was going for. I mean, the one thing that Spencer understood was a kind of, he had that kind of millennial way of sort of thinking about like branding and having it be something that comes out of that comes out of that subculture, but is, palatable, that people
Uh-huh.
can consume. And so I mean, there are certainly people who will call themselves fascists, neo-Nazis, white supremacists, but there are also people who will use any number of other terminology or will avoid that terminology altogether, just because it is easier to appeal to a certain kind of audience if you don't put that out front.
That automatic negative connotation.
Exactly, exactly. Like if you avoid that initial stigma,
Mhm.
you can reach certain segments of the population that are not going to be reached if you use the other kind if you use the in many ways more accurate labels of who they are.
Yeah.
How prevalent is this? Do I know a bunch of fascists that I don't know are fascists?
You might. It
Are there a
depends
lot of
on
people?
well, it's hard to get an exact number. We have had some polling. There was a kind of famous ABC News poll shortly after the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville that found that just under 10% of people identified with or sympathized with the alt-right.
That was my gut
So
feel. 10%.
it's it's around there. And I've seen the occasional polling that puts it at about that. So we're looking at roughly about 10% of people who would explicitly identify with what we can understand as fascist. And then if we expand that to people who might be more sympathetic, who might agree with certain tenets of fascist ideology, but may not be explicitly fascist, we can probably pull that up to uh, honestly roughly 30% potentially, because we are certainly seeing the way in which a lot of those beliefs and those ideas have become mainstreamed and have been picked up and taken up by people who are frankly within the Republican Party. There's no way to dance around this issue,
Yeah.
that with the way in which Donald Trump has been verbalizing so many of these beliefs, and the kind of core belief, the core following that he has within within the Republican Party, that roughly sort of 30% of Americans who are sort of diehard people,
Yeah,
where that's what we're looking at.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about that because you talked about how fascist movements often harken back to a sort of mythologized past of a country and this kind of hyper nationalism. And as you talk about that, it's really hard for me to not think of Make America Great Again and that kind of campaign. And when Donald Trump got elected, there's been a lot of talk about calling him a fascist and this kind of thing. I'm wondering, do you think that's a useful framing to talk about Donald Trump and the current Republican Party as fascists?
There is definitely some value in it. I have certainly at various times said that I've been uncomfortable with explicitly referring to Donald Trump as a fascist, largely because my sense is that Donald Trump doesn't really have a coherent ideology.
Yeah.
So that Donald Trump is a person who will say whatever he needs to say in order to have an audience and to have support. And it is helpful. And certainly to some extent, it seems that the things he says reflect his genuine beliefs. So on some level, there is that kind of thing. But the things he says have been explicitly fascist from the moment he came down the escalator at Trump Tower and announced his candidacy by referring to people who are Latinx as rapists and murderers, specifically Mexicans. That's that's a fascist talking point. That's a far right, racialized, xenophobic talking point that is designed to, at best, expel people who are Latinx from American society, and at worst engage in some sort of genocidal practice. Like that's what it's designed to do from a fascist perspective. And then the campaign continued to put out these kinds of fascist ideological talking points. So when to go back to that idea of "Make America Great Again," that slogan, if we simply look at that slogan, if we think about what that means in terms of harkening back to a mythological past and returning, bringing back that glory, "Make America Great Again." That's the essence of that slogan. Make it great. It was great once upon a time, and it's pretty clear what they mean by when it was great. It was great when there were some forms of hierarchy in the society, and certain groups of people were subordinated, were formally, legally subordinated,
Where everyone was where they
and
belonged. Yeah.
everyone is where they belonged, and that meant that certain people had it good, right? Certain people had it good because other people had it really
Had
bad
it
because,
bad.
of course, right? Like there's a kind of zero sum thinking in capitalist societies and in stratified hierarchical societies. So There, so Make America Great Again is we want to go back to that. We want to make that was when America was great. America sucks now. Why does America suck now? Well, because we don't have that anymore. Because there's a bunch of people who aren't subordinated anymore, at least in the mindset
Mm-hmm.
of the people who believe that slogan. Whether that's true or not, structurally, it is not. They don't care about that. They don't care that it's absolutely false statement structurally. But that's not important to them. They see people who used to be subordinated in places where they quote unquote don't belong, and
On
they want to go
TV.
back
Mm-hmm.
on right on TV in the White House.
Oh,
I mean, we can look at this new kind of wave as really beginning in the reaction to Barack Obama's election. I mean,
really?
the day of the election, Stormfront, which at the time was the big supremacist online space, the largest white supremacist website, crashed because it couldn't handle the traffic. People just flocked to it.
Oh,
And the reaction, and we saw, if you look at the Southern Poverty Law Center's count of hate groups, which has all kinds of methodological issues to it, but we can think of it as representative. It's like a sampling.
a gauge.
Exactly, it's a gauge. And we saw immediately in those first 2 years of the Obama presidency, we saw a huge spike in white nationalist or white supremacist organized groups, but also in the kind of patriot militia groups, which are they're the less stigmatized representations of a lot of those similar kinds of ideologies. So you saw that spike in those groups, and then it kind of waned a little bit, and then again you see something that frequently hasn't happened in the kind of waves of Republican and Democratic electoral processes, that when Donald Trump is elected president, you see that come back up again. And that hasn't happened in the past. When there's a Republican president, those movements tend to kind of shift away. They tend to yeah, because to some
Really?
extent, yeah, because to some extent, the people who are being activated, particularly the more rank and file, you've got your sort of hardcore members of far right movements who are sort of diehards and they're going to be in it no matter what. But then you've got your people who sort of go with the ebbs and flows of politics, and if those ebbs and flows are agreeing with their agenda or not agreeing with their agenda, and so you tended to see these things ebb a little bit during Republican administrations because to some extent Republican administrations were offering that up. But Donald Trump did something different in that he mobilized a group of people, and that mobilization maintained itself because they felt emboldened publicly and emboldened in the street in a way that they hadn't been emboldened prior to that. And so even though
Wow.
he didn't follow through on most of his promises and certainly most of his campaign points that were explicitly fascist, and a lot of the hardcore movement members really they hate him. They see him as just another puppet of like the Zionist conspiracy. They
Ah,
they also understand that having somebody in the public eye who is constantly expressing their point of view is really great for movement building. It's really great for mobilizing, especially when he has a kind of cult of personality that they can then mobilize people out of, which is part of the dynamic that we saw certainly in 2017, right after the inauguration, and in that kind of year that followed, or at least the up to the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, is that most of the far right, the kind of fascist rallies that you saw were ostensibly pro-Trump rallies, or ostensibly free speech for the far right
yeah, free
rallies.
speech.
Exactly. This is their free speech is being impinged upon. So this was a strategic move designed to draw in people who weren't previously necessarily far right fascist movement members, but were part of the Donald Trump support base, and could be drawn in because they are further, in terms of their beliefs, closer to the fascist movement than maybe your average Trump voter.
Ooh, that's interesting. And I was thinking about when you said the murderers and the rapists, because when I heard that, it seemed kind of random to me. Like, why was he saying that? And then once you start realizing that maybe a lot of these things he's saying that you think are random are really coded language, that the people who are receiving the message that he wants to receive the message are very much receiving those messages loud and clear.
Mhm. Yeah. Oh, and
Yeah.
he's very aware of that, and it's not even really coded a lot of the time. I mean, when you say that a group of people are murderers and rapists,
Well,
a
yeah, it's not
racialized
coded.
group of
You're
people,
right.
that's not coded.
You're right.
That's the thing, is that
Yeah.
while other while other right wing candidates, while other Republican candidates have historically used the dog whistles and the code words, and danced around some of these things, that Mitt Romney with his famous like 47% comment, and things like,
Yeah.
right, sort of dancer, and Mitt Romney with his, like, if I had been born in Mexico comment, right? These are dog whistles.
Mhm.
These are dog whistles. They're subtle. They're quiet. No, Donald
They're
Trump just comes out with,
respectable almost.
yeah, he's got an air horn. He just, it is just, he doesn't he doesn't dance around it. He says it. He is the fascist id of the right. The guy who just goes out there and he says it. And because he says these things in this bombastic way, it creates just enough plausible deniability for the kind of rank and file supporter who doesn't necessarily want to be associated with the more fascist elements of it, to say, well, he's doing a performance,
A
and
bit.
he's a bit, exactly, like he's doing a bit. He says these things, they're not meant to be taken seriously or taken at face value, and he's aware of this as a performer. He knows how to get the audience to clap and to cheer, and you'll see him try out material and see how it goes. Is this going to play? Is this not going to play? Like, as a performer, the man knows what he's doing.
He's good. You
So
got to give him props
he's
where props is due.
yeah,
He's a good
yeah. I mean,
performer.
that's where his charisma comes from. That's where his support comes from, is that ability to perform, but also at the same time to be able to verbalize the things that his audience wants to hear. And so it gives him just enough plausible deniability to be able to potentially avoid a stigmatized label, though, one can argue about what that means in terms of transport these days. But and so that you could maybe kind of avoid a kind of stigmatized label, but also at the same time, it's like it works at these multiple levels,
Yeah.
where also at the same time as there's this portion of his audience who hear that and go, that man is saying what I believe, or that man is, pushing our ideological agenda. Here, this is our base. This We now know who to go to build our support base, which is why you saw fascists in his campaign speech audiences in 2016. And you saw them engaging in acts of violence on his behalf
Mhm.
and at his seemingly coded behest, when he makes comments like, I'll pay your legal fees, which of course he never did. Matt Heimbach had to pay his own legal fees, but he was one of those people. Matthew Heimbach, a clear white nationalist. He refers to himself as a traditionalist. Uh,
Another code.
Actor, yeah, another code, and his,
Rebranding, yeah.
yeah, rebranding. Oh, his best rebranding is that now he's rebranded himself as a former white nationalist, even though he's still organizing. But he's been laundered through a certain organization that brings in so-called formers who are not actually formers, and tries to kind of like clean up their image.
Oh, the
So,
ultimate grift. Ugh.
oh yes, it's kind of a yeah. So,
Yeah.
but that's somebody who assaulted an African American protester at a Trump rally, and that was part of what spawned Trump's "I'll pay your legal fees" comment. Is that kind of thing.
That kind of thing.
So, so you've got it's increasingly hard. Like when we think about like who is a fascist in contemporary American society,
Yeah.
it's increasingly hard to tease out who are the fascists of the far right or the extreme right. And these are all very, very the labels are have all have their own problems. I think Cynthia Miller Idris points out that in using the far right, it's the best of a series of bad terms. So there's this in terms of contemporary kind of society, it's hard to tease out now who's on that far right, who's that fascist, who's that extreme right person, and who is increasingly a rank and file Republican.
Yeah. And I thought was really interesting when you said that the leadership doesn't exactly in these structures, white nationalist,
Hmm.
white supremacist groups, doesn't love him. They see him as a stooge, as just another guy who's not doing what he says, but he is great PR for them.
Hmm.
And that's terribly interesting.
Hmm.
What a line to toe. And I guess that kind of goes into the tactics of these groups.
Hmm.
What are these fascist groups trying to do?
Right, right. Yeah, we started with
How do
that,
they
and
do
we
it?
sort of
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So we started with talking about propaganda, and we've been talking about kind of propaganda and how that seeps into the mainstream and how platforming assists them and all of these things, and that's what they're looking for. Like they're looking for attention in that regard. So that's point number one, is they're doing that. Uh, second thing, the second sort of big area of tactics in terms of kind of the what they do in
Mm.
terms of fascist movements is that they are extremely active online. They have a massive online presence, and they have had a massive online presence since the internet was the information superhighway was a dirt road. They've been on it. They
Huh.
were some of the earliest adapters uh, of the bulletin board system, the BBS, where you dial in and you'd be able to download information and leave, it's asynchronous, usually chatting with other people.
Oh,
This was
interesting.
in the 1980s. So you would pay, for a lot of these people, they'd pay long distance and even international charges to dial in and communicate online with other people in the movement. So they were doing that. Stormfront, that
Huh.
website that I mentioned, was one of the. It wasn't the first white supremacist, fascist website, but it is the oldest, and it's one of the oldest things on the internet. So because it was started in 1994. So we're talking about very early adopters. Like they are people who were in this thing almost from day one,
That's funny. You almost don't think that white supremacists would be techies.
but they are. And there's a fairly weirdly large base for it in a lot of ways, because
Funny.
of to some extent the kind of people who are drawn to the movement, but also because the people who are part of the movement, and certainly in the 80s and 90s, because there were more hierarchical structures to this stuff.
Hmm.
Uh, the leadership, or mid-level leadership, are really savvy about how you communicate with people. How do you reach people? How do and more importantly, how do we communicate internally? And that's where I make a distinction in my book when we talk about online. There is an internal online world that is just within the movement for itself. So that could go back to that history of like the bulletin board systems where you call up with a modem and
Uh,
have to like communicate it, asynchronously with people and things like that, to a space ostensibly like Stormfront, or the Daily Stormer just went down recently, as part of the fallout of the Kiwi Farms. controversy.
Oh, I haven't heard about
So
this.
yeah, that's a look into it. It's a really interesting campaign where a Twitch streamer, a trans Twitch streamer from Canada, was swatted a few weeks ago, and she had to flee the country. And there's this site, Kiwi Farms, that's used by people to dox and harass individuals,
Mm.
including Keffals, this Twitch streamer. And so she started a campaign to take down Kiwi Farms, to have them lose their DDoS protection and removed from uh, their hosting service. And so they did, and they moved to one that didn't have as good a DDoS protection, and ultimately that led to 8kun, which is the sort of rebranding of 8chan, which was the site that had the post of the Christchurch shooting massacre. The
Oh,
manifesto was posted there. And so in the wake of that, 8chan went down, got rebranded as 8kun. But anyway, Kiwi Farms went down due to DDoS attacks, and apparently the same sort of protection service
okay.
was being used by 8kun, which is now down, and also the Daily Stormer, which was also kind of famous for organizing the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. So all these sites, all these kind of like hate
There we
sites,
go.
supremacist, fasci-adjacent sites have all just kind of gone down recently. Um, so those were all kind of
Hmm.
internal. Those are all the
Okay.
kind of spaces where people who are like already in it are talking to each other and communicating with each other. And we could think of other ones like Gab is, Gab is probably an internal, because like there's nobody on Gab who's not fascist or fascist adjacent, you know. So those are internal online spaces and internal kind of places.
And that's big for them.
That's big for them. That's huge, because that's the core of movement organizing. It's where they're communicating with each other. It's where the diehards are coordinating. It's where, when we think about, I recently wrote a chapter about mass shootings, and this is where in these internal spaces is where they're encouraging each other to go and
Uh,
engage in mass shootings, and they're talking about supremacist mass shooters. They call them saints, and
uh,
they say, saint whomever, and they keep, who's got the high score, and they brag about trying to beat the high score. And so this is the kind of internal communication that's happening in these places. There's also a lot of really mundane communication that's also happening, because part of why people are drawn to this stuff is because it provides a social world for them to engage in. So
mm,
there's really mundane conversations also about things like video games and music, and on the bigger sites, dating and dating advice. And this is where like Stormfront is really interesting, is because when we look at it, there's so much mundanity in it. There's so much just discussion of like, there's a women's only forum where women talk about a lot of normal issues for women that women talk about with each other.
uh-huh.
And so there's this kind of combination of like the virulent hatred with the mundanity. And so you can
Just a
like
friend group,
come.
just a social group.
It really does become a social group and a friend group. So that's the internal is
Mhm.
like the space where you're hanging out with your friends online, basically. And then there's the external, and the external is your more public facing stuff. So this is your Twitter, if you can avoid getting banned, right? So this is YouTube, if you can avoid getting banned. This is Facebook, if you can avoid getting banned is all very relative on all of these sites, because
Yeah.
uh, research consistently indicates that they are terrible at even enforcing their own terms of service around these issues. But this is your public facing online, where now you're speaking to the general public, and so you'll have there's often a kind of approach where in sociology there's this concept of like front stage and backstage,
Mm,
where the front stage is your public performance, right? It's what you're doing, and you're engaging in what's called impression management, where you're trying to uh, have the most positive representation you can of yourself in the world. and that's what the kind of external spaces are for. Is that's where you get the new recruits. That's where you bring people
Uh-huh.
in. That's where you're doing the kind of public work.
And every group does
And
this, right?
every social movement does
Yeah.
this. That's the thing. This is why I came at this from a social movement perspective, because they all do this, and there's all kinds of data that shows that like the fascist movements are no different than any others that than social movements on the left. Like, and I don't say that in like a horseshoe theory kind of way. I say that simply that like social movements do things in very specific ways. So it doesn't matter the ideology of the social movement. They do these things in these ways because they are how you operate in a cultural and social and structural context.
It's a group of humans. That's what
Exactly.
they're
It's a
going to
group of
do.
humans living in a society, and they have certain kinds of goals that they want to collectively achieve. And so we have created a set of means by which you are going to achieve those goals, or tools that you can use to achieve those goals.
Now, obviously, their tactics online go beyond just discussing ideas. You mentioned doxing a bit before. Could you talk about the role that doxing has played in fascist movements?
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually put doxing in a category of violence rather than simply as online activity, because I categorize online activity as the more mundane elements of it, the kind of discursive elements of the of the kind of social media world. So I put doxing as a form of violence, and that's essentially the last category of what they do is they engage in violence. Fascists engage in violence. Violence is, and we to kind of set a little bit more context and to come back to where I began to some extent in defining fascism. That enforcement of the hierarchy through violence means that violence is central to fascist ideology. And for fascists, violence isn't simply an end. So there are a lot of social movements across the political spectrum that will engage in acts of violence because they see it as a means to an end. For fascists, violence is both the means and the end.
I've always had a hard time with that. Can you
Uh,
pick that apart a little bit?
Sure, of course I can. It also gets back to what I was saying about the street violence and the state violence. So for fascists, we'll start with the means. Because fascists believe that they believe in a hierarchical society that must be enforced through violence. Like I said, they encourage members to engage in street violence. And the way that they do that, so this is going to unpack that idea of violence and the centrality of violence here. The way that they encourage that violence on the street level and ultimately at the state level is that they view violence as an inherently good trait. The ability to use violence, the ability to leverage violence is considered to be
Mm,
a morally and spiritually superior trait among people. So fascists venerate people who are willing to use violence to achieve their ends. And that's where that means comes from. Right? That the fascist is good because the fascist uses violence to get what they want.
they are the
So that
warriors.
exactly, they're the war. There's this warrior culture in it, and then ultimately, when they take control of the state, then that sense of violence as superiority creates an entire society organized in a kind of internal war, and ultimately, hopefully, an external war. So fascists fascist states tend to be imperialist. Fascist states tend to want to conquer and control and command other states who they see as inferior, who they see as historically subordinate to them. And we can think of a certain very clear examples of that in our contemporary context
Hmm.
of states that are behaving in that way. So these are elements of a fascist state, and fascist states glorify war and violence as making people inherently superior. So that warrior is always inherently superior to the non-warrior. The person who's willing to use violence is always inherently superior to the person who is not, to the person who insists on non-violence. And
They are weak.
exactly, they're absolutely weak. And fascism abhors weakness. It hates weakness.
Mm.
Weakness is subordination. Weakness, puts you in a position of subordination, and weakness is something that the weak person rightfully is subordinated, or rightfully is victimized, is rightfully placed in that position of being the subject of violence.
So I can see how street violence and physical fighting can kind of fit into that narrative, but how does doxing fit into this?
So doxing, and this is one of the interesting things about doxing, and how it's used by different sectors of the society. In particular, when we look at like the fascist and anti-fascist, because they both use doxing.
Yeah.
So when fascists use doxing, they're not using it in the way that anti-fascists do. And in my book, I talk about doxing by anti-fascists as a form of public shaming because, like I've said, like we've talked about already, there's a stigma associated with being a fascist. For now, there's a stigma associated with being an explicit bigot in our society. So I mean, we certainly have
Hmm.
all these structures and systems of bigotry and hierarchical domination in our society, but one can't use certain kinds of words, and one can't behave in certain kinds of ways in a public sphere. And so anti-fascists leverage those stigmas by engaging in doxing, by pointing out, hey, this person is a fascist. They attended a fascist rally holding a tiki torch, shouting, Jews will not replace us. You know, this is here's where they live. If you're their neighbor, you should probably be aware of that. Here's where they work. If you're their employer, do you really want this person representing your whatever it is that you do, in some way to the public? So they're leveraging stigma, and they're leveraging that stigma to do what social movement scholars, and in particular counter movement scholars, call increasing the cost of participation. So, and this is the argument that anti-fascists have made, that prior to the contemporary kind of online version of this that we call doxing, they used to call it outing, because most people would hide their fascist identity to some extent.
Hmm.
And so they would do this with flyers and protests and things like that, to leverage that public pressure. Because the thinking was, if a person who is explicitly involved in fascist movement activity is having to look for an apartment, and having to look for a job, and having to explain, especially now in a highly mediated environment, having to explain to a future employer that why they showed up to this fascist rally and engaged in this activity, that makes it hard for them to on some level, to continue to be involved in the movement element of fascism. And so for anti-fascists, the idea behind doxing is you shame people publicly so that it makes it complicated for them to continue to be part of the movement, because they have to do all of these kinds of things. They have to look for work. They have to look for jobs. They have to, walk through their campus with everybody knowing that they're a fascist, right? These
Uh-huh.
things make it hard, make it complicated
You've
for
got a
them.
scarlet letter on your chest.
Exactly,
Hmm.
exactly. So you've got this kind of they increase the stigma. That's
So,
the idea.
so how do
That's
fascists use doxing?
Yeah. So fascists use doxing. So if we think about it, anti-fascists are opposed to a movement that believes that there's this hierarchy of people, opposed to a movement that's white supremacist and patriarchal and homophobic and transphobic and Islamophobic and anti-Semitic, and we can continue listing biases and
Uh,
prejudices. The opposition to that, therefore, is a movement that believes that we should have a society that is more just, more equal, where there should that all of these biases need to be the systems and the individual biases that come with them need to be eliminated. So anti-fascists are, in that sense, pro-social, right? So there's not I mean, as hard as they've tried, and certainly elements of the right have been relatively successful at stigmatizing certain kinds of anti-fascism and certain expressions of anti-fascism. It's hard to stigmatize the core idea behind anti-fascism.
Yeah.
Like, it's really hard to stigmatize that. Like, it's a very hard thing to do to make a person feel bad about being someone who wants a world of equality. It's not an effective means of doxing. So when fascists engage in doxing, they're doing something very different. What they are doing is they are publicly saying to people who are anti-fascists, to people who they target because they've moved on to this new process of doxing trans people, of harassing trans people because transphobia plays a little bit better
Mm.
in the society and in our culture, and it's a particularly vulnerable group of people in our society. So they've moved to that. So when they dox somebody, whether it's because they're an anti-fascist or it's because they're trans, and they what they're saying to that person and what they're saying to the rest of the world is, here is this person. They are our enemy. We want to cause harm to them. We know where they live. We know where they work. We know how to get in touch with them. We know we know their phone number. We know all of their social media accounts. We can make their life a living hell by leveraging the violence of our movement against that person.
Is it just trans people, or have they leveraged that against other groups as well?
Oh, they've leveraged that against, basically anybody they label their enemy.
Mhm.
So we're, I just wanted to say basically that this is a tactic they developed against anti-fascists that more recently they have mobilized in the same way against trans people. And if we really look at it, the tactic itself, and much of the contemporary kind of manifestations of the fascist movement that was something that they really developed in the online kind of manosphere slash incel space, and they really became good at it during the Gamergate
Mhm.
uh, period, where they really mobilized. And a former student of mine wrote a really wonderful essay at the time that makes the point that Gamergate was a hate group in the same way that we can think of a more organized group like Patriot Front or something like that. Uh, so this was a very intentional kind of types of campaigns. So there was a kind of practice there, and the misogyny of that era drew in a lot of fascists, who then drew a lot of those people into like the fascist movement. So this is fascist doxing has its kind of predecessor. It's like the proto-fascist doxing was Gamergate, and then came the kind of fascist anti-fascist clashing period in the early Trump years, where they started doxing people who were anti-fascist, but they also doxed people who were Jewish in the same way that they're doxing trans people now. They would dox people who are Jewish, particularly reporters, particularly people who might be in other kinds of public facing that in other public facing roles. So academics, politicians, they began to harass them simply for being Jewish. So it's whomever they view as as being the subject of their violence, the subject of their need to establish that domination through violence. And the current trend, the current thing that is happening now is that because transphobia is something that the mainstream right has really picked up on and is really trying to use as their culture war issue to mobilize their base. The fascist movement, the far right, is right there, moving along with that and engaging in if not actual acts of violence, threatened acts of violence. Because that's what they're doing. Like when Proud Boys
Yeah.
go to a drag queen story hour, right? Like when they go into a drag show, to storytelling drag shows for children, you know, they're not going because of the ostensible sort of weird issue, quote unquote issues, I should say, that the right has sort of tried to build uh, around trans identity and things of that nature. They're going explicitly because they're Proud Boys and they want to demonstrate that they are there. They see you, they know who you are, and they want to cause harm to you.
To physically intimidate you.
Yeah, like if they can't do it there, they want to physically intimidate people, and they've done it. They've shown up to people's homes, to homes of activists, to homes of scholars. They've shown up to people's actual homes to quote pay them a visit. This
Yeah.
is a movement that is out there specifically to engage in violence. And so they're doing it. They're engaging in acts of violence. They're engaging in everything from petty bias crimes, because they see vulnerable people in the course of their everyday lives and can engage in what's referred to, what Jack Levin and Jack McDevitt call a thrill-seeking bias crime or thrill-seeking hate crime, where it's a crime of opportunity. It's based on your prejudice, and you just do it because, like,
They're
it's quote
there.
unquote fun for you,
Yeah.
right? The target is there, and it's fun for you to use violence to hurt people, and to hurt people who you have a prejudice against. So they do that kind of stuff. It's part and parcel of sort of their everyday existence. But they also engage in violence against anti-fascists. They've certainly been known to, if they see anti-fascists on the street or in a social context, and the anti-fascists are vulnerable enough, because that's also important sometimes, is
Uh-huh.
that it's a lot about attacking vulnerable people. They've attacked anti-fascists. They've caused harm to anti-fascists. And then we move that up. They have in the past tried to assassinate anti-fascists. So we know that members of the base were arrested in an attempt to assassinate anti-fascists in Georgia. We have had actual anti-fascists murdered by fascist movement members. We've had
Yeah.
attempted murders where people have been shot. We've had attempted murders where people have been stabbed. People have been beaten up. We've had attempted arson attempts. Attempted arson, where they start fires at people's homes, and home invasions, break into people's homes and try to beat them up. So they do have concerted attacks against anti-fascists. So that's movement counter movement violence we're talking about here. Then there's that protest violence that we talked about.
And that's where we're going to leave you guys this week. Mid-conversation and dying to know more. Check us out next week on Wednesday to hear the full story about how anti-fascists organize and the misconceptions of that scary word, Antifa. Until next time, take care of each other, and we'll talk to you soon.